Assalamu alaikum. Today I'll be responding to some of the comments that Dr. James White made in his latest Divide and Line program. But before I do so, I'd like to play a clip or two of him agreeing with me in respect to John chapter 9 verse 38 and his rebuking or his refuting of some Christians regarding their defense of John 9:38.
And I even saw in one of the people that was responding to Ijaz. In other words, I'm agreeing with Ijaz on this part, where his friends or his people writing to him are just don't understand what they're talking about. There is no question that there is a variant, and it's an important variant at the end of John chapter 9. No one disputes that. Well, no one. I certainly don't dispute that. No serious biblical scholar is going to dispute that. I mean, facts are facts. It's right there. You just look it up. It's right there. And I find it to be a particularly relevant one. One of the guys that was responding was saying, but there's all these minuscule manuscripts contain it, and all these things is basically making a majority text argument. The reason it is a very significant variant, even though it's a very small number of manuscripts that do not contain it, is because they happen to be the earliest exemplars, the earliest examples of at least two of the major manuscript families. In other words, it's representing a wider geographical distribution than if it was just the Alexandrian manuscripts versus the Byzantine or something like that. Codex Washingtonianus does not have it. That's relevant.
Dr. White then transitions into mentioning my studies of textual criticism, and I thank him for understanding that I am actually studying this topic and I'm putting the time and the effort into studying it, but then he makes a really bad argument when it comes to the Quran. So have a listen and see what he says.
Ijaz is doing a tremendous amount of reading in textual critical information. That's obvious. He can't do that same amount of reading in textual critical information about the Quran. And he knows that. The programs that we have, the databases, the number of manuscripts, you just can't do that with the Quran.
So he makes a very odd statement. He says that we can't read the same amount of works as we do for the Quran when it comes to textual criticism as we do when it comes to the New Testament. But there are two different entire fields. There is the New Testament textual criticism, and then there is Ilm al-Rasm al-Mushaf, which is a science in itself that predates the Christian science of textual criticism, predates it. And the important thing is we have been able to study the Quran, so we may not have the programs available, but we do have the databases, and we have a significantly larger amount of manuscripts of the Quran than we have of the New Testament. So I don't know where he got those figures from, but he should at least know of my paper from 2014, I think, where I responded to some of J. Smith's arguments about the Quran, some of his really strange claims. And so at that time, I think if he reads that paper, he'll understand that the same amount of study that I've done with respect to the New Testament, I've done equally about the Quran. And I am in contact again with both New Testament textual critics and scholars of the Quran. It's not an either-or situation, or that one is easier, more accessible, and one is less accessible. Both are very much accessible. Both traditions are alive today.
I am like the man searching for the honest person with the lamp in the darkness. I'm searching for the consistent Islamic apologist who will apply the same standards to his own text that he applies to the New Testament, the Old Testament.
Now, here I'm going to let Dr. James White respond to Dr. James White. As you've just heard, he said he's still waiting on a Muslim apologist to be consistent, one who applies the same level of criticism that we do to the New Testament to the Quran. But later in his very Divide and Line program, about 1 hour and 3 minutes in, and it's the next clip I'm going to be playing, he actually mentions that the Quran and the New Testament are two distinct documents. It's like he actually says it's like comparing apples and oranges. And so he knows that. He knows that you can't use the same methodology for two different types of text. He absolutely knows that. You can't use Arabic orthography in the same way that you would compare Greek orthography. They're going to be very different. Their developments were different. So when he raises questions like these, it brings up the problem of, is he himself being consistent? It's a lot like saying that there's a car, a Honda, and a car that's a Ford, and you have a mechanic, and you tell the mechanic, fix the Honda in the same way that you would fix the Ford. Use the same methodology. Just because they're the same type of vehicle that they're cars does not mean that the same method would work for fixing both of them. And that's the message that needs to be get across. It's not that we're being inconsistent, it's that we are being consistent. We recognize that they are two different forms of literature. They're absolutely different. While at some point there's intertextuality, and we can compare them and we can use some similar methodologies, this is not always the case, and I agree with him on this point. It's like comparing apples and oranges, so it's unfair to say that we should it's unfair to say that we should apply the same standards to the Quran that we do to the New Testament. They're two distinct documents, apples and oranges. Dr. James White, I fully agree with you.
Now, I realize comparing the Quran and the New Testament, a little bit apples and oranges. It's a much younger document, much smaller, should have considerably less textual issues, given its history, lack of persecution, all the rest of that kind of stuff.
He then goes on to say the following.
Well, there are textual variants in the Quran. Everybody I've debated on that. Well, everybody. Well, Yusuf Ismail, Shabir Ali, they've all admitted it. I could guarantee you some of the Muslims that I've debated would never admit that. Now that I think about it, didn't necessarily come up with them, though.
Here we have the issue of Dr. White misrepresenting Dr. Ali and our brother Yusuf Ismail from South Africa. They both accept, as all Muslims do in Orthodoxy, that the Quran was revealed with ahruf and with the qira'at, with styles and modes of recitations. So we believe that these modes of recitations, which are quote-unquote variations, are actually inspired by God. So it's not that our variations are not should not be classed or equivocated in the same way that there are New Testament textual variants. This is completely dishonest, and it's a misrepresentation of the views of Islam, the orthodox views of Islam, and the orthodox views of Dr. Shabir Ali and of Brother Yusuf Ismail.
And it is his recognition, I think, of the fundamental problem that Islam faces. Islam, in its founding document, cannot avoid dealing with the al-Injil, the people of the gospel. Cannot avoid dealing with the al-Kitab, the people of the book. The Kitab is there. The Injil, the Torah, they are Natsal. They're sent down. They contain light and guidance. They have to deal with this. And the problem is that it's plain as the nose on anybody's face that the author of the Quran provides no meaningful interaction with the New Testament, especially as it exists today. There's no interaction. There's no...
One of the problems we have here is that Dr. James White is saying that the Quran needs to respond to the current New Testament. Well, in that case, it needs to be said that the current New Testament, think of it as puzzle pieces that have been put together. So different pieces of different manuscripts have been put together into one edition, a critical edition. And this critical edition, there is no exemplar, meaning that there is no manuscript in history that matches this exemplar exactly. There's always going to be some variant or contradiction, meaning that the current New Testament, the Greek New Testament, the Nestle Aland 28 GNT, as it exists today in the Greek language, has never existed before in history, and there is no exemplar which represents that text at all. Exactly. And I need to be clear, when we refer to the Nestle Alan 28 GNT, it's referred to as a hypothetical master copy. It's not referred to as the master copy or the original. It's referred to as the hypothetical master copy. So that distinction needs to be made. Secondly, we agree that the Injil is a light. We agree that Christians should judge by the Injil. But then you have to ask yourself, is the New Testament the Injil? And obviously the answer is no, because we know that the process of the writing of the New Testament, its development, is purely human. There's nothing divine about it. And that humanity has been expressed in John 9:38. We simply don't have a problem like that with the Quran, right? And to go even more further than that, what laws are there to manage any society based solely on the New Testament? The mitzvot of the Old Testament cannot be compared to, I think, the 32 or 35 commandments that Jesus gives in the New Testament. So you're looking at 613 laws to manage society, an entire nation, versus 35 laws that most Christians today don't even know. I believe Christ says in the New Testament, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. And if you ask a Christian how many commandments they are or what the commandments are, they simply won't know. So therefore, this is how we know that the New Testament is not the Injil. Clearly it's not the Injil. Furthermore, we know that the author of the Quran had a very intimate knowledge of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that's in Surah Al-Ikhlas, the Surah of sincerity, where it says Lam Yalid wa Lam Yulad. In Isaiah, the word Yulad is meaning for the word child who will be born. And so that Hebrew term Yulad was taken by the Christians as a prophetic reference to God becoming incarnate and therefore having a son of God. And so the Quranic author, he does not need to go and refute every single piece of Christological evidence that Christians pump out every single year based on their symposiums and coming up with new arguments. The Quran just goes directly to the point. God does not beget, nor is he begotten. Full stop. Nothing more, nothing less. And he uses the word Yulad, which unites the Old Testament and the New Testament and then negates it completely. So alhamdulillah, it's simple for us. Furthermore, the Quran also uses the term Muhaymin to describe itself, meaning filter. The Quran is a filter for what the Jews and the Christians possess today. So if whatever they believe is filtered through the Quran and agrees with the Quran, we accept it. If it filters through the Quran and it's not accepted, therefore we reject it. It's quite simple. And the question begs itself, why does the Quran describe itself as a muhaymin? Why would you need a filter if what you already have is pure? If you have pure water, do you need a filter? Why is there that redundancy? That does not make sense. That is an inconsistent argument by its very nature. So, just to simplify the matter, I do not think that Dr. White was accurate in his statements, in these specific statements that he just made.
And Ijaz has realized, well, the best way to approach this is to go after the text, because the vast majority of Christians don't know anything about it. And you know what? He's exactly right. Vast majority don't. Now, we've been doing our best for a very long time to try to change that around here. We've done entire programs on a single textual variant.
I wouldn't necessarily say I got into the subject because I know that a lot of Christians don't know about it. I actually got into the subject because of a lot of Christians attacking the Quran using textual criticism. So now, being able to have learned Ilm al-Rasam al-Musaf and then learning New Testament textual criticism, it's helped me, it's strengthened my faith, and it's allowed me to apostate some Christians. I do it on a regular basis now using textual criticism. He's quite right that a lot of Christians are ignorant about textual criticism, but the problem has really been spawned by people like J. Smith, who use uninformed arguments against the Quran with quasi-intellectual arguments textually critically. And so when they do that, you now have Muslims going to respond to them. And so Muslims learning textual criticism of the New Testament is simply a reaction to Christians having gone to the Quran and trying to apply their methodologies to the Quran to falsify the Quran. And so I'm not disagreeing with him that most Christians are ignorant about these issues. They obviously are, the vast majority are. And so, but I've chosen this path simply because there were Christians who were already on it, using these methodologies to attack the Quran, and I embarked on this path to protect the validity and the inspiration and the beauty of the Quran.
And I ask the listening audience to pray for Ijaz Ahmed as well, and to not respond to him, unfortunately, as some people do, with anger and vitriol, but to show the love of Christ. And even in disagreement, Ijaz, we care for you.
I'd personally like to thank Dr. James White for his prayers and for asking people to pray for me. I very much appreciate the gesture. I appreciate the kindness and the tone that you've actually taken in this video compared to the previous video. Uh, I think that you're a very kind person. You've been kind to me. We've had our disagreements, but in the end, I agree that we should all pray for each other's guidance, health, wealth, benefits. You know, you're a healthy guy. You cycle quite a lot. I see your Facebook posts about it, so I know that you're into that cycling stuff. I've gotten into it myself, but I'm trying. I'm still a beginner. In any case, I just wanted to express my thanks for your sentiments. I duly appreciate it, and I want to make the same point for the Muslims. Do not respond to Christians with hate and vitriol. Yes, we know and we understand that people like Sam Shamoon and Jonathan McClatchy will be abusive and intolerant. They might curse you, they might insult you, and then pretend that they did nothing wrong, or that they might even defend the usage of their offensive terms by going to the Bible. So, and I believe Dr. James White would disagree with some people saying that the Bible allows them to be abusive and intolerant. So, I agree with Dr. James White's sentiments, both with respect to the prayers and both with respect to the avoiding intolerant and abusive comments from certain elements within the interfaith scene. So thank you, Dr. James White, for raising this issue and bringing it to the forefront. At this point, I don't think there's a need to insert any further clips of Dr. White's video. I've watched all of it, I've made notes, and I'm looking at the notes now, and these are mostly things that he's already said in the previous video. So I'm going to try and just respond to a few of them and wrap up the video and keep it short. One of the things he says is that we can't buy into the pre-Ottomanic manuscripts. Well, yes, we can, because they have been carbon dated and paleographically dated. The New Testament papyri have only been paleographically dated, and as Brent Nongbury has demonstrated, that paleographic dating of the New Testament papyri is in danger, basically, because the ranges have changed significantly when you look at the comparanda or the comparison manuscripts, when you're looking at the orthography, papyrology, and codicology of these documents. So yes, we can trust it, and we do trust it, and we fully buy into it. There's no problem with them. Dr. White went on to mention equal scales. I already explained previously why we are using equal scales, and I gave his own example of apples and oranges to refute himself, so I'm not gonna comment on that. He said that P52 is probably the earliest. Probably is the key word there, because now we know it's not the earliest. It's most likely not the earliest, as I've pointed out in my previous video in citing Brent Nongbury's analysis. Let me see, what else does he say here? He goes on to say that the lacuna, the text of John 20:28 is found everywhere after P66, therefore it must fit into P66. Again, this is a repeated argument. He says we can't contest that, but we can contest that simply because P66 is the earliest exemplar of that text itself, and it has a lacuna at a very important point, and we don't know how the words "and my God" got in there in the later editions. The earliest edition does not have it, and that's the main point. Anything later can have it. It doesn't matter. They can have anything, and my horse, and my cow, and my cat, and my whatever, and my car. But it doesn't matter what it says after that. What we need to know is what did P66 say, and what did the intermediate text, that is the text before P66 say itself. So we don't know what it said, and we don't know what its intermediate text said. All we know is what the text after it say, and because of that, we can come to the agreement at least that we cannot be certain about what P66 said. And since all manuscripts are weighted on their authority, and he did mention that the earlier manuscripts have more authority, then in this specific case, if you're given it more authority, then you have to accept that the lacuna is a major problem, at least in this incident. In some way, he returns to P52 and he says it simply can't be contested. There's no question that it goes back to the 1st century, given its knowledge of geography and its name of places. But that's exactly one of the problems I brought up in one of my, I think my first stage debate with Stephen Martins from Toronto, where in John 1:44, the village of Bethsaida is called a city, and it did not become a city until a couple of years later, I think 3 years later, after Jesus' ministry. So, earthly ministry, that is. So, his claim that it has to be from the 1st century because it gets geographic names correct is absolutely absurd, and this is proof by contradiction. It did get something wrong. It called a village a city. So, this is not an evidence for it, it's actually an evidence against it. When it comes to Codex Bezae, that was simply a response to Dr. White repeatedly saying there is no variant, there is no variant, there is no variant, no variant exists, no variant exists of John 20:28. And I simply wanted to point it out that yes, there is a variant, it's in Codex Bezae. So now he shifts the goalpost. He says, well, I was only referring to the terms "and my God." But even in that term "and my God," there is the variant. The defining article "ha" is missing. Now, in our discussion, Dr. White mentioned that perhaps the initial scribe, when writing the text, erased the words "ha theos mu." Erased those words and replaced it with just "theos mu," which is a problem. Why did the author, if we assume the original author or the original scribe was the person that made that correction, why did they make that correction? Why did they go against all the other textual traditions? So then it seems to me that the author of this codex, or the editors of this codex, if we assume later editors, which I do, then we have to assume that this was a theological change. And so this isn't an argument and that's positive for Christianity. It's actually an argument to demonstrate that scribes were theologically altering core verses of the New Testament, and in one way, removing the defining article gave the ability to some Christians to interpret it radically differently, and that is the problem. That is the problem that we have to discuss here. So, minimizing it by saying, well, it does say God, but that does not solve the problem. It makes it worse because the way in which they've put the context of the word God makes the problem far more worse Christologically, because it opens it up to what you would call heretical interpretations, and that is the point of bringing up that variant unit. At some point in the video, around 57 to 58 minutes, Dr. White makes the claim that both variants in Codex Bezae for John 20:28 refer to Jesus as God. And he says, I'm engaging in conjectural emendation here. This is not the case. I'm looking at the evidence. I'm asking myself a very simple question. The scribe had "ha theos" and then erased that, and then he had just "theos." He removed the defining article for a reason. He went against a massive textual tradition, And we know for a fact that the Western text type, the exemplar for the Western text type, is Codex Bezier. And so to say that it's mind reading, that Dr. Ullman is saying that it is possible that the earlier versions of Codex Bezier, the intermediate texts, could have also omitted the ha, theos. That's not mind reading. That's simply schematics, schematology. That's just trying to get genealogical solidarity. It's a science. It makes perfect sense. You're simply going along with what the text demonstrates of itself, and because it's representative of a text type, we're able to come to those conclusions based on the quality and the importance of that codex. As for P66, you did not resolve the problem with the lacuna in it. Like I've said previously, and I'll say again, there's a gap in it. It's the earliest witness, the earliest extant witness for P66, and it's missing the words, and my God. So for you to claim that and my God must fit into there, then you must have contemporaneous evidence or evidence before P66 that conforms to your conclusions. Because you do not have that evidence, and all you have are anachronistic arguments, you're taking later manuscripts and their terms and reinserting it into P66. This is where my disagreement will be. But you simply can't do that, and doing that is playing games with the New Testament. And if we were to do that with other passages, I mean, we can raise a lot of problems with other New Testament passages that have that have gaps in them, and we want to insert specific variant units that we've chosen among ourselves that we don't agree with, right? So we don't want to have to come to that conclusion. In the end, you went on to use the Quran, a manuscript of the Quran. So I need to point out something to you. The Quran has two main traditions of its transmission. We do not believe in Textus Criticus. We believe in Textus Receptus. So the Quran that we trust and accept is the Textus Receptus, showing us an ahad alone, a single manuscript that may have a lacuna in it, does not affect anything, because we go with what you would call the majority text, or the Textus Receptus. That's what we would go with. So it's very much distinct. Our traditions are distinct. We have a continuous oral transmission of the Quran, and so that's how it differs from the New Testament. Whether or not a scribe for the Quran orthographically represented something different, whether it's with a defective aleph or using vowel points one way or the other, the harakat, it simply doesn't matter, because both the textual and the oral transmission of the Quran conform to each other, and so we don't have these problems where a lacuna simply demolishes the validity of our text. In your case, it does, because there's nothing contemporaneous to it. There is no extant oral transmission. That died out very early, so we can't help it. And we do know what Surah 20 says. I mean, you look at the top copy codex, yeah, and we do have earlier manuscripts that validate it, so I'm not going to get into that argument now. But alhamdulillah, I don't think that the issue you raised was very relevant. It's more fallacious. It's a too cocky, where you're trying to say, well, Ijaz, look, I'm applying the same standards to the Quran, therefore if you apply the same standards to the New Testament, it wouldn't work. You have to understand, Dr. White, that these are two completely different texts with two completely different forms of transmission. You have already agreed to that, apples and oranges. So to say that a lacuno's text simply means that we can't trust the Quran is to betray your own condition of being consistent. That's all I have to say. In the end, I would like to say I thank you for your discussion. I wish you well I wish you well and safety on your trips, and God willing, we can continue this discussion at a more scholastic level when the time is appropriate. Because I understand that both my audience and your audience are going to find that these topics are very complicated. They might find it boring, but to me, it's probably one of the most interesting things in the world. So all I have to say is praise be to God for this discussion. It's brought about a lot of interest, and God willing, it would lead some people to the truth, and that's the end goal. May God guide those. May God guide us all to the truth. Amen. Amin. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for listening.